Greetings, everybody. Today we're going to do a kind of a walkthrough lecture on Chapter 1 of Chomsky's book, Profit Over People. And of course, the title of this chapter is Neoliberalism and Global Order. Just like the way we went through the intro, I may at times read some direct excerpts from the text. Other times we'll just kind of, briefly cover some points here as we make our way through. Keep also in mind that beyond Chapter 1, you are going to be reading Chapter 2. There may or may not be a lecture on Chapter 2. We'll see how it goes. It's a lot to cram within the 1 week that we have for this module, but we will, in any case, see how it goes. All right. Right away on page 19 and then carried on into page 20, we talk about the Washington consensus. And I can just read it on page 19. The neoliberal Washington consensus is an array of market-oriented principles designed by the government of the United States and the international financial institutions that it largely dominates, and implemented by them in various ways. For the more vulnerable societies, often as stringent structural adjustment programs. The basic rules in brief are, and these are the basic rules of the Washington Consensus: liberalize trade and finance, let markets set price, in other words, get prices right, and inflation, macroeconomic stability, and lastly, privatize. A big slogan for the Washington Consensus here is that government should get out of the way. An important question that needs to be answered, and it's mentioned here, it's indicated, who are the architects? Who came up with the Washington Consensus? Who looked to maintain the Washington Consensus as it was just outlined? Well, this is a pretty easy answer. Huge corporations, right? Huge corporations who control the international economy, the flow of capital from internationally, and they tend to dominate policy formation as well as the structuring of thought and opinion. And that last one's interesting, and that's really what's going to be carried forward into Chapter 2 of this book, Consent Without Consent. So we're talking about the public consent. But it is the job, the aim of these huge corporations to structure the thought and opinion, right, of the public at large. Moving on to page 21. You kind of got to read up on some of the history here. But the United States had a very interesting position in the world post-World War II. Essentially, it came out of World War II as the primary superpower in the entire world, right? We're talking about a major increase in markets. We're talking about a major increase in overall wealth. We're talking about the baby boomers, right? The big influx or the big boom in population that was possible after World War II. And we're also talking about a very strong military that was that was able to really seize onto territories throughout the world. In very basic general terms, it's kind of noted that England, the colonial superpower, for many decades, essentially kind of maybe even reluctantly passes this torch to the United States, because the United States is simply capable post-World War II of having these markets and maintaining these markets throughout the world, not to mention that military might. I say reluctantly because obviously Britain probably did want to try to hold on to as much power as they could, but it really wasn't possible. If you look at the numbers, how many lives were lost in World War II, that's a whole other issue. But the United States, of course, they lost quite a bit, but not nearly as much as most of Europe, right? Especially look at Russia, who lost millions upon millions of people. So they were just in a better position to maintain some kind of control and influence in the world, right? So it is important, with all that in mind, it's important to take a close look at what the United States has done after World War II, with this notable positioning in the world as a colonial kind of superpower, right? One that has this kind of ability to grasp onto markets throughout the world and express its kind of dominance in many ways. It's important to look at what they've done. And we don't learn this a lot, when you think about history classes in high school or even, at the college level. I don't teach history. But you don't talk a lot about South America and the U.S. involvement in South America. But it's a pretty shaky history once you start taking a closer look. And Chomsky notes a few examples here where the U.S. definitely kind of intervened, of course, because of the influence of corporations, international corporations, where they intervened in South America. And we're not going to get into all of those examples, but I encourage you, especially if one strikes you as that you have some curiosity, to look more into it. He's kind of giving you a cursory glance, a brief glance at the U.S. involvement with some of these South American nations, but you really should look into them further. And in fact, we have a research paper at the end of the semester. This might be important to your research, might be an angle that you want to kind of use as far as the research that's important to you. So you never know, something you can look into. But overall, and I find this very, very interesting, personally. Page 21 is where he starts to talk about this, but Latin American, one thing we recognize is in various countries in Latin America, nationalism is on the rise, right? And a part of that is the urge and the desire and even the demand for more state autonomy. That a state, just like we would probably think of the United States, or any country for that matter, in this kind of sentimental fashion, should be in charge of its own destiny, right? It should be able to work for its own interests, right? And essentially kind of protect itself from interfering forces externally from other nations or other parts of the world. Autonomy, a certain kind of self-determination here, right? A national determination, a national pride. The privatization of industry, right? Which means that you take some of these important industries of a country, whether it be oil, whether it be steel, whether it be agriculture, whether it be whatever, and the government starts to pull those industries in close so that it can keep a better handle on the profits of those industries and distribute that to its country and make sure it works for its own country. So there's various ways that a country can express this kind of autonomy or self-determination, right? Now, the irony here, the deep irony here is that a country's freedom, a country's nationalism, a country's autonomy, especially when we think about the context of South America, is bad for one notable group of people. Corporations. Corporations who are trying to keep a kind of stringent and effective control over the economies of these countries, right? On a very kind of, on a smaller level, I recognize that you want the best for yourself, right? That you have your own personal interests in mind. And I applaud you for that. But the irony is that they don't applaud you wanting this kind of, you having this personal interest in your own security, because they think of your resources, what you have for yourself, they think of it as their own, right? So nationalism for these countries throughout South America actually spells out problems for the corporations that are trying to force their influence and force their products into these countries, right? All things that are bad for U.S. corporations and the free market is what we're talking about here. And they are unsuitable as these corporations see what is rightfully yours as theirs, right? There's the irony, it's not yours. All of those important resources that your country has within its boundaries, within its borders, they're not yours. They're ours, they're the corporations, and we don't appreciate you having this pride in keeping it to yourself, or this necessity to keep it to yourself. So that's a big general point that Chomsky makes here in this chapter. We talked about semantics last time around with with the introduction. I'll just say something briefly about it. They tend to throw out a few words that, again, there's kind of a positive understanding of, or a positive connotation surrounding, such as security and democracy, right? We feel drawn to these words, but they are used in reference to the upper classes and large foreign enterprises, right? So whenever we start to see these words that we're kind of familiar with, we have to recognize that they are in reference to the upper classes and the large foreign corporations, the enterprises that are trying to shove their interests into these various countries, right? Okay, so on page 23, the Economic Charter of the Americas is mentioned, and the purpose, or the motive, or again the slogan of the Economic Charter of the Americas, and this is kind of an organization that comes together and talks about important issues within the continent, obviously important economic issues. They have one goal: eliminate economic nationalism, eliminate a country's desire to protect their own national interests, right? And they want to get rid of that, and they do so in various ways. With this accompanying belief that these governments in these South American countries, they should not be the economic beneficiaries of their country's resources. They should not be the ones benefiting from these vital resources. Who should be benefiting from those vital resources? These international foreign corporations, right? They should be the ones who benefit from them. Now, we're not going to, as we state these ideas, you might be having, dare I say, an emotional reaction. Well, that doesn't sound fair. A country should be able to kind of protect its own interests and benefit from the resources that are found within its boundaries and its borders, and maybe distribute those, whatever's to be gained from those resources, distribute that to the people of its own country. So you might be having a reaction here, and we're not going to get into that too much. We maybe can talk about your opinions and your feelings about these ideas in the discussion, but here we're just kind of barreling through the points, right? Covering the points. All right, one thing, and as far as that discussion is concerned, what's yours is mine. Forget your nationalistic pride. My economic interest is more important than that, right? What's yours is mine. A question I have, and I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but one I think we should at least discuss: what causes an attitude like that? What causes an attitude for me to say, what's yours is not yours, what's yours is actually mine, right? What causes an attitude like that? Something to keep in mind. A lot of what we talk about in South America, believe it or not, Chomsky labels as economic experimentation, right? But we're actually kind of conducting these economic experiments within these South American countries. Now, one thing, I'll take you back to your science classes, perhaps back in high school, or maybe even in college. What do we know about it? What do we generally understand about experiments? You don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that's kind of one of the privileges of the principal architects of the Washington Consensus. Whatever the outcome is going to be, they're going to be fine, right? Because they're the ones conducting these experiments. But when you take into account the people of South America, especially the poor, especially those who are already having such trouble to hold on to some standard of living or some sense of dignity, those are the ones who suffer from this erratic experimentation, right? But the architects of the Washington Consensus, they conduct these experiments, but they'll always be okay, right? And if it works out in their favor, wonderful. If it doesn't, move on to the next experiment. And unfortunately, that tends to be the trend that we see in South America. On page 27, we actually get the title of the book, and I just want to mention a couple of things here about this. Profit over people. This is kind of a general way of understanding what Chomsky sees as the problem. That these international corporations value profit much more than they actually value people, right? Profit's an interesting word. And again, I think, we talked about neoliberalism, we talked about free markets, we talk about capitalism, and the positive aura or the positive kind of feeling or understanding we have of these terms. And I think profit falls into those categories too. Did you make profits this year? Yeah, we're up. Our profits are up. Fantastic, right? Great job. But there's a couple of things you always, if you're being very critical, there's a couple of things about profit you always want to keep in mind. First of all, wherever there's profit, what's the flip end of that? What's the flip side of that? Wherever there's profit, there's deficit. Wherever there's gain, there's loss. It doesn't exist, or it doesn't occur. Profit doesn't occur within a vacuum or all by itself. Wherever there's profit, there's always going to be loss and gain. Wherever there's going to be people who profit, especially when you get into this idea of massively profiting, there's going to be people who massively lose out as well, right? So there's always this kind of binary relationship between profit and loss. If you take that to an even more dramatic level, and you start to kind of infuse this idea of life and death, profit is life, right? And the more of it I have, the more opportunity for life I have. And I'm being very general there. But what's the tail end of life? What's the flip end of life? Death. And there is a slogan, and again, it's a very kind of dramatic and critical one, that profit actually equals death, right? That as some people or some corporations profit immensely in the world, that leads to such a loss for others, especially impoverished populations, especially in third world nations, not to mention other, more developed countries. We're actually talking about the death of individuals as well, right? The death of people. So I think it is imperative, it's important to be very critical of the word profit here. So just to mention one last thing about profit, let's remember what's happening here, right? The 1% versus the 99%. As mentioned in the last lecture, that is not just a domestic reality. It's not just occurring within the United States. This is a global phenomenon. It's a global trend, which means the world's largest corporations are profiting immensely. Well, what's that mean for the vast amount of populations? They're losing out, right? There's a major deficit there. I think it was interesting. I'll take a quick sip of water if you don't mind. I think it was interesting that we started with Orwell, a little bit of that Blair piece, discussing colonialism, because a lot of what we're dealing with here, as we mentioned last time, is just a continuation of colonialistic practices, right? Just in a new and different world where, goods and services do kind of travel at the speed of light. So it's a much different playing field here. But the relationships of power, we could say, have really kind of stayed the same. I think a good way of thinking about why we have such issues here is, you can think of like the world as kind of like a board game, And at some point there was the initial setting up of these various pieces, right? And once those pieces, I got, it's almost like the game Risk even, right? If you ever played the game Risk, where I got, this kind of standing army over here, another standing army over there, right? So all the pieces have been on the board for a long period of time. After colonialism and the initial kind of acquisition of territories by Europe, right? We talked about England passing the torch to the United States, whether that be reluctantly or not, after World War II, because the United States was very capable of taking that torch from them. But the problem here is that nobody has wiped the board clean. There hasn't been a reset button. So of course, so many discussions take place I believe personally, so many discussions take place without a reference to historical truths, right? Historical realities. But nobody has wiped this board clean. Of course, we're still dealing with colonialism and the consequences of colonialism in some way, shape, or form, because it happened before, right? So there was no reset button. This all didn't just become eradicated and we're dealing with new problems. It's a continuation of an age-old problem, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. Page 29. Repeating this point, because I think it's awfully important. Radical nationalism is the antagonist of corporations. There's a lot of irony tied up in this idea. When you think about the United States and you think about its relationship to Britain, and we go back to the Declaration of Independence and saying goodbye to England for the rest of our lives as we start to secure our own independence here, there was an immensely popular and animated radical nationalism taking place during that time. And I think if you ask anybody who has a belief about this country, that was a very necessary radical nationalism. How could it not be? Because it's what helped us to forge our own path within this world. But the irony here is that the United States, especially as influenced by these corporations, again, as Chomsky kind of presents to us, do not respect this radical nationalism of other countries because it gets in the way of imposing free markets on them, right? Don't close your door to the free market. That would be an inconvenience to us, right? So radical nationalism, according to Chomsky, is the antagonist. It is the enemy of corporations. How dare you stand up for yourself? How dare you stand up for your country and protect yourself? Our economic interests are at stake, right? So you better keep those doors open. Continuing with that sense of irony and that kind of almost that hypocrisy. I think that's a word we can use here, hypocrisy. The question is asked on page 30. How did Europe and the US and those that escaped European control succeed in developing? Very simply, they defied the free market, right? When you think about countries like the United States, England, other European countries that were or other countries that were controlled by European dominance and colonialism, the only way that they were able to secure their own independence and their own economic independence was to actually defy free markets and close off their economic borders to other countries, imposing tariffs, controlling markets. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy when you have countries such as these who are now looking at these other countries who want to express a very similar economic independence and saying, shame on you. This is going against the rules, right? You should be open to the free market. There's a large level of hypocrisy here. There is, right now, and things are so complicated and contradictory when you think about the American political scene right now. You got candidates saying everything and anything, it seems. But if I go back about a month ago, there was this kind of idea that Bernie Sanders, who's no longer in the race, or he's still in it, but he's just endorsed Clinton, so it's obviously he's not going to be the Democratic candidate. But Sanders and Trump actually were on the same page with one pretty important issue, which was opposing the TPP and the TAP, I believe as well, which are these massive trade agreements, which is all about the free market, right? Imposing or, having the free market and making sure that corporations are not restricted in any sense of the word. I think a part of the TPP is actually that corporations can sue governments, which is pretty new and a very controversial idea, that a corporation would actually be able to sue a government because the government's getting in the way of their economic interests, right? Or their rights as a constitution. Very quickly, let me mention one thing about neoliberalism. What's liberalism, right? Liberalism is this idea that people, here I am, flesh and blood, right? People deserve rights. People deserve rights. Neoliberalism is the idea that corporations should have the same rights as people. And again, you can agree with that or you can disagree with that, right? That's what's wonderful about these ideas, is we get to debate them and we get to discuss them. You might have heard the slogan, corporations are people too. And again, you might agree with that or disagree with that, but that's what neoliberalism truly is. It piggybacks off liberalism. I guess you could say it piggybacks off liberalism in the sense that all the rights and natural rights and privileges that are afforded a citizen, an individual, right, an actual person, those should also be applied to corporations, because corporations are people too and deserve the same rights. Therefore, I can sue governments, right? I can sue the government. Corporation can sue the government if it feels its rights and privileges are being restricted or what's the word I'm looking for? Inflicted upon, right? I know there's a better word that I was looking for there, but that's okay. That my rights are being restricted as a corporation. Okay, so Bernie Sanders, Trump, I don't know if this is still the same, going to be this way, but they were in agreement of opposing the TPP, whereas other candidates were having trouble opposing the TPP, right? Which is very much neoliberalism in a pretty clear example. Okay, page 32. And I will read on page 32 because he's talking here about the effects. Okay. According to Chomsky, neoliberal doctrines, whatever one thinks of them, undermine education and health, increase inequality, and reduce labor's share in income. That much is not seriously in doubt. So there's three, for Chomsky, clear consequences of neoliberal policies: undermine education and health, increase inequality, and reduce labor's share in income. Right? Those seem to be three notable effects of neoliberalism. Okay. So moving on here, when we talk about the Washington Consensus, continuing with this conversation, it's essentially forcing countries to open up their markets to Western products and investments. We talked about that national pride, that national determination. Well, this is to say, enough of that. You need to open up your country, and you need to open up your economic borders so that we can force open markets and bring in Western products and investment. Chomsky offers some pretty notable examples of this that we're not going to cover in this lecture, but you've done the reading. And again, I would encourage you. You never know what your research might be on, but it might be worthwhile looking into some of these examples that he provides for us, right? And if I say open up your economic doors, or I'm going to bust them down even, right? Find a way to bust them down. And I'm going to flood your country with Western products. And I'm going to bring in a whole lot of capital flow, right? I'm going to bring in a whole lot of Western money to invest in some of these corporations, which just means that the money is going back to the West. This decreases a country's economic potential. So you can see that some of these countries have every reason in the world to close off their economic borders if they're truly trying to increase economic gain for their own governments and their own people. But the Washington Consensus is essentially saying, break down those doors, open up those doors, or we're going to give you a pretty hard time. Okay. And there's a major hypocrisy here again, just to repeat it, when you recognize that one of the major ways that the US and England and other countries found economic success and economic independence in the first place was by not abiding by free markets. But now the hypocrisy here is they want other countries to abide by the free market, right? Okay. So Washington bars development in other countries, yet proclaims to help and encourage success. There's a big difference between what a government says it wants to do or see in other countries and what it actually does. So there's always a major gap between what it says and what it actually does. Washington might say it wants to help and encourage success in some of these other countries, notably Latin America. But the economic policies and the free market and the Washington Consensus that it essentially enacts is not really helping. So there's kind of hypocrisy there. Okay, not a huge thing here, but worth mentioning. He talks about the Pentagon a little bit here. And I think he talks about it more in chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken. But when you think about the Pentagon, what do we think about? National security, right? The way Chomsky looks at the Pentagon is it's the place where it's the method in which the government can easily take money from the American public through taxation, right? If I tell you right now, we pay a lot in taxes. I think like a third of our paycheck goes to taxes, right? Which is a fairly big chunk. But if I were to say to you right now, and a lot of that money that we get out of your taxes, guess what? It's going to go to help poor people. It's going to go to help poor people, right? Or it's going to go for infrastructure, road development, bridges, right? Things like that. Some people might find that questionable, right? And disagree. Well, I don't want my money going to that. Are you kidding me? Why would my money go there? But if I take your money out of your taxes and I say, well, this is going toward your own security, this is going to help keep you safe, that's a tough argument to oppose. And that's what Chomsky essentially says to the Pentagon. It's taking money from the American people through taxation. It filters through the Pentagon, and then that money goes to giant corporations, the military-industrial complex, other corporations, under the guise or for the sake of safety and security, right? It's a very easy way of separating people from their money to simply say, this is going towards security. And you should know, if you've never looked into this, you should know, and I don't have the exact percentages, that most of the money that's taken out of our taxes, for those of you that work, for those of you that have moms and dads who go to work, most of the money that comes out of taxes does go to military defense. So it is going towards security, right? And that's for some people, it's a hard argument to oppose, right? Because safety, for many of us, is paramount, especially in the world that we live in today that is filled with so much conflict and strife. So he does kind of mention it there. In addition, though, keep in mind, if I take money out of your taxes and I put it into social programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, there's an actual benefit that comes back to the people, right? There's a real, tangible, economic benefit that comes back to the people. If I take money out of your paycheck, through taxes, of course, and give it all to the Pentagon or to defense spending, there's no, and this is important to note, there's no economic benefit that comes back to the people. You might feel safe, you might feel secure, There's an argument out there that military, we say, oh, it goes to military defense. Some people call it military offense when you think about what the United States, how the United States is handling itself throughout the world. It's actually more offense than it is defense. But regardless if it's offense or defense, there is no economic benefit that comes back to the people. So this is money that leaves, goes off into the Pentagon, and never returns, right? But security is priceless. And of course, that's debatable, right? We can have our own beliefs there. Page 38, Chomsky mentions that the free market is used as an ideological weapon to discipline the defenseless, right? The more and more we hear this idea of the free market, that it is a certainty in our lives, that it is the way of the country, that it is the wife of capitalism, and therefore there's this important union between them. It leaves people defenseless, again, we've mentioned this last time, of alternatives, to be critical of it, to question it, right? So it essentially leaves, it is a weapon to discipline the defenseless. I will read a little bit on, let's see here, page 38. We just got one more minute here. This is pretty quick, believe it or not, right? We'll see if we do another lecture on chapter 2. Most likely we will, but that's a lot for a week, so I'm not too sure how we're going to fit everything in, including some assignments that you'll have as well. But we'll see how we manage. So on page 38, I'm just going to read here. Okay. This is actually page 39. I'll read at the top of the page. Contemporary experiments follow a familiar pattern when they take the form of socialism for the rich within a system of global corporate mercantilism in which trade consists in substantial measure of centrally managed transactions with single firms, huge institutions linked to their competitors by strategic alliances, all of them tyrannical and in internal structure, designed to undermine democratic decision-making and to safeguard the masters from market discipline. It is the poor and defenseless who are to be instructed in these stern doctrines. This is basically telling us that a free market, believe it or not, especially for those in charge of the free market, is not that free, right? That there's actually heavy restrictions and heavy regulations that take place to make sure that their interests are always secured and that other countries are actually working against their own interests. And we talked about that earlier, right? But this is kind of, as he mentions at the very end, it is the poor and defenseless who are to be instructed in these stern doctrines. It is the poor and the defenseless who have to basically accept these ideas that the free market is really kind of a rigged system that is not at all free and does not help the vast majority of people who are unfortunately caught within this free market system, right? Lastly, Chomsky mentions here that when you think about workers who are caught within this free market system, Chomsky says they're not honorable, right? The work that these people do within a free market system, especially when you think about the control and the dominance that is enacted upon them, that they are held, that controls them, they're not that honorable, and they become a spiritual subclass, meaning that they don't work for their own interests, right? They can't work for their own interests. So there's kind of a sense of their own spirit that's being kind of lost here, right? And I guess you could say that is unless they seek out change. All right, so that's gonna do it for this lecture, and we will see you soon, potentially on Chapter 2. If not, we'll be moving into the next module where we will be talking about neoliberalism in education, right? And seeing how this mindset finds its way into the classroom, right? The university and our high schools as well. Thank you.